Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast with Ali Rock. Simi Raina is the head of legal at Webflow, one of the fastest growing companies on the Forbes Cloud 100 list. Simi's impressive career has taken her through some of Silicon Valley's top tech companies during their different phases of hypergrowth, including Salesforce, Uber, and Visa. In this episode, Simi shares invaluable insights on networking, job hunting, and the unique aspects of in-house legal work, from product counseling to commercial transactions, and negotiating budget for the team. Her journey is inspirational, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, Simi, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's great to be here.
I am looking forward to diving into your career path and learning more about some of your upward career changes you've made over time. You've worked at some of the fastest growing tech companies in the Bay Area. But before we get into it, I do want to start out with a quick icebreaker. I want to ask you about your favorite part about your job, specifically working at Webflow.
That's a great question. I would say, and this is going to sound really corny, but I mean it, but my favorite part of the job is it's the people. I've built out, I say very proudly, humble brag here. I've built out a tremendous team and I really just enjoy working with them. They're some of the brightest and just most fun and kindest people I've worked with. So that's the best part for me.
I love to hear it. And we'll get into sort of the growth of Webflow and when you joined as, the first person on the legal team and building it out. But I would love to go through sort of your career story, and we'll take it back to your time at Santa Clara in undergrad. So I want to talk about when you're studying finance there. Did you know that you wanted to be a lawyer at that point?
Yeah, so I don't know that I always knew that I wanted to go to law school, but I'd always been interested in the law. If there's one skill that I have, it's that I can read tremendously quickly, which I was told at a young age that would be a major asset in if I ever went to law school or was a lawyer. So I feel like it was silly little reasons that planted the seed, but probably what propelled me to law school faster than I might have was I graduated from Santa Clara with a finance degree, as you said, in 2008 in the midst of the financial collapse. So that was just, really spectacular timing there. And so I think that probably expedited the decision to go to law school. And so I went from there to UC Hastings, now UC Law SF, just straight out of undergrad at 21.
Nice. Yeah, you must have done well if you were tutoring. Now let's talk about your journey at Hastings/UCSF. What did you think you wanted to do after graduating, and what was your law school experience like?
Yeah, so I knew pretty early on, I want to say maybe even as I entered law school, that I ultimately wanted to end up in-house. I grew up in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. My dad's an engineer. As we discussed, I was a finance major. So I always kind of had that tech business background and interest. And so I knew going into it that I wanted to go in-house, or at the very least, I wanted to be a business lawyer. And in terms of my experience at UC Hastings, um, it was a great place to go to school. It's in downtown San Francisco. And I think just I loved the environment, right? I mean, you're being surrounded by like-minded people who have a passion for learning. I think the interesting thing about Hastings is it's known to be a bit of a breeding ground for judges. And so there were a lot of people at Hastings, maybe more than what you would expect for a school that's in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. A lot of people who were really interested in going into public interest, and a lot of them did. So that was kind of an interesting side to Hastings as well. Sorry, UC Law SF. It has been rebranded, but I have not gotten the memo.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And then I want to ask, did you have any big law aspirations?
Um, yes and no. To the extent that I needed to do that in order to sort of fulfill my goal of ultimately ending up in-house, that was something that I was open to. Um, Again, following on from that 2008 graduating with a finance degree, 2011 with a law degree was a pretty rough year as well for, being employed. There were a lot of 2010 grads that were still unemployed. And so it was not easy. At that point, I think like a lot of us just took what we could get to a certain extent.
Gotcha. Nice. So you graduated in 2011. You knew you wanted to work in-house, but you did end up working at a firm. So I'm curious how that transpired and what kind of things were you working on at the firm?
Yeah, so I was working on a mixture of things. So there was some transactional work, some employment work, some litigation as well. I will always be grateful, right, for my first job out of law school, but I definitely learned very early on that litigation was not the path for me. And then just knowing that I wanted to go in house, I learned everything that I could. I made some actually great, really long lasting relationships. I'm still friends with some people that I worked with at that first firm, but I quickly was, trying to get myself on the path of gaining the experience that I would need in order to move in house.
Got it. So were you sort of networking in the background while you're at that firm?
I was, yeah. And I think that can be a little bit tricky because, especially when you're early in your career, when you're networking and when you're talking to people, I don't know, at least this is the way that I looked at it back then. I felt uneasy about it because I felt like everyone that I networked it with knew that, I was young in my career and I potentially wanted help with you know getting a job or mentorship around getting a job. So it wasn't something that came easy to me, but it's definitely, it was important, and I highly recommend doing that, to anyone who's in a similar situation when you're trying to make a move like that.
Yeah, it can be so intimidating if it's brand new. I mean, how has that journey of sort of networking evolved as your career has progressed?
That's a great question. I would still say it's not my favorite thing. um, I enjoy networking from the perspective of, I like meeting with people who are facing similar challenges, right? So my networking tends to result in not a huge network of, somewhat shallow is not the right word, but you get what I mean, right? It's not a huge network of sort of relationships without a lot of depth. When I tend to network people and get to know people who are working in a similar space, they're people that I really keep in touch with, and we have regular touch points and we bounce ideas off of each other and we kind of learn from each other, and there's like a mutually beneficial relationship there.
Nice. Before we move on to your first in-house role, what advice would you give to folks who are in law school about networking and building relationships that are
Mhm.
not just shallow?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the biggest piece of advice I'd give is it's really important to do it, even if it makes you feel uncomfortable. I think having regular touch points with those people, so it's not just, you're at some networking event and you talk for 5 minutes and you think your job is done, right? Like, actually attempting to maybe meet fewer people, especially if it's something that makes you uncomfortable, so that the people that you do talk to, you can build more of a foundation with and really get to know them and they can get to know you. I think that can make it also a lot less uncomfortable, if it's not something that's in your nature to just sort of be the social butterfly bouncing around the room and meeting people that way.
Love it. That's great advice. Now, so you went off to Salesforce in 2014. Now, Salesforce, I assume, was much smaller in 2014. So I'm curious about one, how did you land that role? Because I know it was your
Mhm.
goal to work in-house. And what was Salesforce like in 2014?
Yeah, so I actually didn't join Salesforce.com. I joined the Salesforce Foundation. And so the Salesforce Foundation at the time was only 300 people. So actually much smaller than, what you were talking about with even Salesforce.com back then. So in terms of the legal department, it was just me and the GC. So we were serving the roughly 300-person organization. And the work was actually really interesting because Salesforce Foundation, is very obviously the nonprofit branch of Salesforce.com. So it did all of the nonprofit work, the grant making work, a lot of the social impact work. But what was interesting was we also were selling Salesforce products, right? So it was to, the government, nonprofits, and higher ed. So you're sort of going through the same thing that a commercial attorney at Salesforce.com may be doing, but your customer base was totally different. And how I ended up there, this kind of goes back to your question about networking. Another thing that made me super uncomfortable back then, I think, was asking for help, especially from people who I have not yet been in a position to help myself. And so when I was applying to in-house roles, I applied. all over the place. I think I probably applied to like 50 different roles, and by and large didn't hear back about any of them because I had no prior in-house experience. And with the Salesforce role specifically, I reached out to my friend's brother-in-law worked at salesforce.com, and my husband was like, ask him to submit the resume for you. And I was so uncomfortable because I barely knew the guy, but I asked him and he did it, and it guaranteed that my resume actually got in front of the hiring manager, who for some reason, and I'm so lucky that this happened, even though I didn't have the right experience, she took the call with me and she interviewed me and she liked me, and that's how I got the role. I still don't know why she made that choice, but I will, I'll forever be grateful for it.
That's amazing. Yeah, I love that success story about networking and leveraging that to get your job. So you finally made it in-house. Was it sort of everything you expected it to be?
Oh, I don't think you can ever, like, it'll never align with your expectations if you haven't done it before. So it wasn't what I expected to be, but I really enjoyed it. I loved sitting in the midst of people who worked on all aspects of the Salesforce Foundation, right? The accounting team was there, the finance team was there. That was the floor that I sat on anyway. The people who actually were making the decisions about where the grants should go and what sorts of like social impact events we should throw, they were all in the same space. And so it was a really fascinating position to be in because you're immersed in the legal side of all of these things, but you're also learning about the business side of these things directly, right? In a way that I don't necessarily think that you can when you're straight out of law school and in a firm, because you're really just immersed in it.
Nice. Sounds like a great learning experience. And so can you talk about your transition to your next role as associate counsel at Visa?
Yeah, so I was very happy at Salesforce when a recruiter from Visa reached out to me, and the general counsel at Salesforce had just left, and so I was kind of at this inflection point internally anyway. So I took the call, and the rest, as they say, is history. I moved on to Visa, and I was there for about a year and a half, where I did mostly commercial work, but also some product counseling as well. Yeah, and then from there I went to Uber.
Nice. And how many people was Visa when you joined?
Oh, I have no idea actually. That
How about the
company, I mean, that company is so old and so huge. The legal department alone was probably at least a couple hundred people.
wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it was big, and I think also because the company is so globally dispersed, you never sort of have a sense of just how many people there are.
Gotcha. So you were doing mostly commercial work, some product work. Can you talk
Mhm.
about, for folks that don't exactly know what that is, what does that sort of entail? What are the differences in pros of each?
Yeah, sure. So commercial work generally refers to contracts, right? So on the sales side, I supported three different products. So one of them was a very old legacy Visa product called DPS. That's essentially what makes your debit card work. And then one of them was Visa Checkout. So that was a product that Visa sort of built from the ground up while I was there. And then the third one was CyberSource. So that was a company that Visa had acquired before I joined. So it was really interesting to sort of work on something that was acquired, something that was very old, and then something that was built from the ground up. And so from a commercial counsel perspective, I worked on the sales agreements for all three of those products. And the nature of those sales agreements were really different as well, because on the DPS side, I was mostly negotiating with banks. And then on CyberSource and Visa Checkout, it was large enterprise customers, and then also some smaller businesses as well. From a product counseling perspective, most of the product counseling work that I did was on Visa Checkout. And so with that, you're really working with the business to ensure that the product is being built with sort of legal compliance and privacy, and your customers being top of mind, and then making sure that the way the product actually works is reflected in your terms, right, and is compliant.
Very nice. And do
Mhm.
you have a preference for one type of work over another?
That's a toughie. I I think the major pro of commercial work is you have frequent wins. There are some deals that close quickly, there are some deals that take months and months, but it's very rewarding when you're done. And the end result of what you've worked on is very tangible because it's literally dollars, right? It's dollars and cents, and the work that you're doing contributes towards your company's bottom line, right? So that is very rewarding. I think on the product side, it's very interesting, right? Because you're working with people like engineers, you're working with product people, and you're more deeply immersed, I think, more on the company strategy side of things. You're understanding what the company is building and why, and what are your customers' pain points. Why are you building the things that you're building in the way that you're building them, right? So I think you get a really deep understanding of your business on the product side of things. And as far as, what I prefer, I don't know that I have a preference. So at Visa, I did very little product counseling. It was mostly commercial work, but at Uber, it was much more of a split. Still more on the commercial side, but much more of a split. I actually really loved the variety of doing both, because then you get the experience and the thrill of like closing the deals, right? And celebrating alongside your sales team.
No
You
worries.
also get that sort of like the tricky problem solving side of things that you have with product counseling. I think if you are not a very detail oriented person, commercial work is probably not for you, because it is, it is details. You have to be detail oriented if you're going to enjoy that type of work.
Gotcha. That's awesome
Mm.
to hear. It's interesting hearing about some of the differences working with sales folks versus product folks. Is there anything else about Visa that you'd like to talk about, especially being in sort of that fintech space?
that that was my first time being exposed to sort of a heavily regulated industry. Right now, obviously Uber was fraught with some interesting compliance and regulatory considerations, but it was very different from Salesforce. So even though I worked at a nonprofit, and there's obviously rules and regulations around being a nonprofit, like Visa was very different. And it's also, I've always found it fun to sort of work in different industries. So there was fintech, and then obviously Uber was completely different, and now Webflow is completely different.
Awesome to hear. It sounds like you had a great time at Visa. I'm very curious to hear about how things were at Uber, especially when you joined in November 2016. I know there was
Yeah.
a lot of things going on with that company at that time. So, how were things going when you joined? And it sounds like you're working on product council work, if I'm not mistaken.
So initially it was just commercial work. And then it became a lot of product work as well. So I supported a product called Uber for Business. And Uber for Business was almost like a little mini startup within Uber. So I didn't work on the ride sharing platform or the app itself. I worked on essentially the enterprise side of Uber, right? Selling to other businesses. So it was interesting because I was somewhat insulated from a lot of the controversy surrounding Uber, right? Like I wasn't involved in the employment side of things, but just working at a company like that where we were always in the news, right? Whether it was from a regulatory standpoint, like irritating some regular in some country or a city or a state, or the controversy around employees versus contractors, right? In terms of driver classification, all of that was there in the background. And it was something that, even though I didn't work on it directly, um, I was acutely aware of. And you had to be able to speak to it, because when you spoke to customers, these were things that they care about, right? Most enterprise customers, they care about who they're doing business with. And so it was definitely, it was top of mind, right? The controversy was top of mind, but I personally had a great experience there. I really liked my team. There was a lot of change while I was there, right? We got a new CEO, we got a new GC, we went public, and through all of that, I was really lucky because I had the same manager for 4 years, and
Wow.
I actually can't think of anybody else that I worked with at Uber who can say that. And there's a lot to be said for having like a stable layer of management, especially if you like your manager. So I actually
Totally.
really enjoyed my time at Uber, all of the controversy and negative press aside, and I learned a tremendous amount while I was there.
I love that. Can you talk
Mhm.
more? I want to get deeper about how you said, you were fortunate to have the same manager for 4 years. Why
Mhm.
is having someone like that who's a mentor that can advocate you for is important?
Well, I think when you if you're constantly getting a new manager, every time you get a new manager, you're proving yourself to that new person over and over again, and that's really hard. That's not to say when you have the same manager you can coast. I actually think it's the opposite, because they know you really well. They know when you're doing your best work and they know when you're not, right? I think it's more so the level of autonomy that you frankly earn, and the level of trust that you've earned, right? It adds, right, year over year. It adds to itself, and I think it puts you in a position where you get to do really interesting work, sometimes work that may have more risk involved in it, sometimes work that maybe a manager who doesn't know you and doesn't trust you as well might not give to you. So I really got the benefit of that, of just independence, autonomy, trust. I got to sort of work on all kinds of interesting things and raise my hand and sort of do what I wanted, because there was plenty of work to go around. But my manager really trusted me to take the hard things and like do right by them. And I don't think that that's as easy when your manager doesn't know you so well.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys had a great relationship built on trust. And can you talk about sort of that promotion from counsel to senior counsel? Like, what sorts of things did you do to set yourself up for that? Were you constantly bringing it up? Were you asking for that promotion? Was there a path to it, or was it sort of not as clearly depicted?
That's a really great question, and I think multi-prong answer. Like, one, you have to talk about it. Even if you have a manager who has your back and is going to advocate for you, if you don't bring it up as something that you care about, right? Like, it will take much longer. So I think that's really important. So yes, it's something that we talked about. It's not something that I feel like I had to fight for. I feel like my work spoke for itself, right? And then I think the other piece of it is taking on more responsibilities when you don't necessarily have to. So I was the second after my manager, I was the most senior attorney on the team. And so when we would hire new attorneys, I would usually train them, right? I would often be their point of escalation for red lines or explaining what our positions were. I wrote our first negotiation playbook, right? Of like, this is
Wow.
how you respond to these sorts of red lines. Here's why. This is what you do if a customer asks for this, etc. And so I think taking on things like that when you don't necessarily have to, where it's not the bread and butter of your role, I think one, it shows a level of commitment, right? Like, you care about your role, you care about your team, you care about the company. And I think it also just shows that you can take on more than maybe what was expected of you when you were hired. So it just puts you in a better position for that promotion.
Amazing. And was this the first time you were managing people?
So I didn't actually manage people. Well, I dotted line sort of managed people, and then when my manager went out on parental leave, then I managed the team as well. So
Got
it was in that role that I got to have that experience. And again, this is why I was saying I think it's so important to have a good manager. Of like, he made that space for me to do that. Right? He didn't have to, but he made that space for me to get that experience and do those things, even though I wasn't, these people's direct managers.
Got it. I love that. Yeah, it sounds like you had a great time at Uber. Any other takeaways from Uber before we talk about Webflow?
No, other than, I mean, I think when people are comfortable in their roles, right? It's easy to not take the call when it comes. So when I left Visa, I also had a really good relationship with my manager at Visa, and he actually left Visa and went to Uber maybe a year and a half or 2 years after, and I ended up in his org again. But that's besides the point. My point was is I was actually very comfortable at Visa. I liked my manager, I liked my work, I was learning a lot, and I also happened to be 5 months pregnant with my first kid, right? And to go from that to a pre IPO company that was known back then to just be the Wild West, right? I mean, I was through that whole interview process, one foot in, one foot out. Why am I doing this? Why am I even talking to them? Right. But I'm so glad that I took that call. It's very easy to find a reason not to. So that really that's a big takeaway, because I'm forever grateful for what I had and what I learned at Uber.
Nice. Yeah, sounds like the takeaway is just never shut the door on opportunity.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you found out about Webflow? I mean, it is such a rocket ship. It's a Forbes Cloud 100 company, and
Yeah.
you said you joined when it was just a few hundred people, right?
Yeah. So when I joined, I think I was employee number 230 something, and then now we're pushing about 800.
Incredible.
Um, yeah, so I mean, similar to what I just described about leaving Visa, I had no intention of leaving Uber. I was happy there. I had been there for 4.5 years, but I was still constantly working on new things because every time Uber for Business launched a new product, it rolled up under that umbrella. So it was like supporting something brand new. Um, but the recruiter from Webflow reached out, took the call, deja vu, same. I was 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and really thinking, what am I doing? Because at this point, my second kiddo was like not even one when I was interviewing, and it was in the midst of COVID, and my house was under construction, and we were living with my parents. Like my life was in complete disarray.
Oh
When
gosh.
yeah, and I made the wise choice to interview, at a startup company.
Yeah,
Um,
it's just the growth is just amazing. I mean, were you
mhm.
the first legal hire?
I was, yeah. So up until that point, we had been using outside counsel exclusively. And it was actually outside counsel and my then manager, who was the VP of finance, it was actually outside counsel who advised him, like, it's time and you need to hire someone internally.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
amazing. So when you joined, I mean, did you have to set up processes from scratch? Like what did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, there were no legal processes to speak of across the board. And when you think about what a legal department is required to cover, right? There's everything on the people team side. So there's hiring, there's, employee life cycle, there's employee claims and disputes. Then there's the sales side, right? Setting up the whole process for reviewing contracts and when do you need to get your accounting team involved and when can you like there that's just a whole nother thing. Then there's product counseling. Then there's, the face of your company. What do your terms look like? What does your privacy policy look like? Do your terms actually reflect what you do? So I mean, I want to say when I joined, that first 6 months I almost quit like 3 times, mostly because I
Wow.
felt like I was just, in over my head from the perspective of, I had never built a legal department from the ground up and there was just so much work to do. And even though, I had the benefit of sort of having some generalist experience from my first role at the firm, and then being exposed to a whole lot between Visa and Salesforce and Uber. Like, you don't know what you don't know. So every day I felt like I was uncovering things that I needed to add to my list of things to do, and part of that list was things that I had no idea how to do. So it could be
Nice.
overwhelming at times.
That is absolutely awesome. Are you able to talk about maybe like one specific example of a huge obstacle or challenge? It could be anything, working with outside firms or setting up a process that,
Mhm.
you overcame.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the sales side work is probably a great example. The sales team was so happy to have a lawyer in house, which I was surprised by because think about being in sales and then not having to have anyone review your contracts. I was really expecting a lot of pushback, but they were actually so grateful to like have someone in seat who could really help with that. But there was no process to speak of. It was the wild, wild west. I didn't know where any of our contracts were stored. Some things were being signed in like Adobe, some things were being signed in DocuSign, some things were being signed in PandaDoc, right? There were things in Google Drive, there were things in Box, there were like it. So I think probably one of the biggest projects that we underwent within my first year, was like a find the contracts project in tandem with actually figuring out how to work with the sales team. So rewriting our terms, right? Deciding when we're going to negotiate, when we're going to not, what are some terms that the sales team is empowered to sort of talk about versus not. And then we stood up a contracts management system as well, which was a huge cross-functional lift, but so necessary to actually figure out where everything is and have a process in place and be able to prioritize what you're going to look at when.
That's amazing. Love to
Mhm.
hear it. And then how did the role evolve as you've been there now for almost 4 years? So I'm sure you've, dove into your role managing folks and
Mhm.
hiring. How did the role evolve over time?
Yeah, I mean, so there obviously a huge component of the role is hiring and managing, right? Especially because now we're a team of 11, including myself. So
Amazing.
that's been great. But there's when you're a company that's in hyper growth stage, like you're never just managing people, right? So I would say every day I'm getting my hands dirty working on something with someone on the team. So certain aspects of the role have remained the same, and then certain aspects have changed. Now, as the company has gotten bigger, and we're much more focused on OKRs and KPIs, like these were just acronyms that were chucked around and not really used my first year, right? So even for the legal department, really thinking about strategy and how do we deliver value, right, to the company as a legal department, and what can we do to actually propel the company's objectives and goals forward, right? That's now a huge part of the role in a way that it wasn't the first year. It's not that I didn't care about that, it's that I didn't have the bandwidth. I was just playing whack-a-mole, right, just putting out fires left and right with really no sort of strategy or forward looking bone in my body for that first year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. I want to pivot to another topic that is kind of interesting on in-house legal teams, and that's
Mhm.
budget.
Yeah.
How has your journey been working with with CFO or finance or whoever you work with to get budget for things like outside counsel or buying
Mhm.
contract management or hiring or headcount? How has that been?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think probably depending on who you ask, the answer is going to be wildly different because there's so many factors that go into that, right? One is just sort of the macroeconomic climate, right? Two is how's your company actually doing? If you're hemorrhaging money left and right, it's really difficult as a legal department to ask for money. And I think that like the third huge one is obviously what stage your company is in, right? So Webflow, I am like very proud and lucky to say by and large has been doing pretty well since I joined. And so at the beginning, asking for headcount wasn't hard at all because it was like I said, I had this list of things that just needed to get done, prioritized list of things. But even the things that were P zeros, there were a lot of them. Like it was not a one person job, and so I had very little pushback for the hires that I made my first year. And they're all actually still with me, which is awesome because, like I said, that first year was a wild ride. But no pushback because there was so much work to do, and some of it was really important. And I think a lot of asking for headcount and money is around framing, right? So at the beginning, you could argue there's just a ton of work to do, and so I need headcount. Okay, fine, go do it, right? Now, I think when you ask for at this stage, like where we are now, when I ask for money or when I ask for headcount, it really is much more tightly tied to company goals, right? So, for example, if I want to hire a employment attorney, which I did earlier this year, that's not a role that you would typically think of as being like a growth enabler, right? You're not hiring a commercial attorney to go help sign sales deals. You're not hiring product counsel to make sure that your product is buttoned up. But when you think about risk mitigation and compliance, that in and of itself is a form of enabling company growth. Because if you are coming across as an immature company who is not compliant and you're being sued by your employees, right? One, it's very difficult to attract good talent. And two, all of that stuff costs the company money, whether it's because you're being sued after the fact or because it's a giant mess that you're left cleaning up when it actually matters, right? Whether it's, because you're thinking about going IPO or you've become the target of an acquisition or whatever. So I think making the argument for getting ahead of some of these things, that helps a lot as well.
Amazing. I just love hearing about the journey. It fires me up just how much you guys are growing and all the challenges that come with it. Last question, and then we'll open it up. I want to know about your experience working with outside counsel.
Hmm.
Has it been sort of the same firm or firms? And how do you vet these firms? And like, in where do you draw the line in terms of work that you want to do in-house versus outside counsel?
Yeah, I'll answer your last question first about where I draw the line on doing work internally versus leveraging outside counsel. Um, I think that work that requires a very specific knowledge of the business, right, is best done in house because you're going to lose so much time and it's so inefficient to have the back and forth, right, with outside counsel and your internal business teams. I think contracts is a great example of that, right? Someone who has been in seat, a commercial attorney who's been in seat for like 3 months, they're going to know what your accounting team would say yes or no to. They're going to know what your disaster recovery plan is. They're going to know what your compliance posture is and if you can say that, you comply with certain things or if you don't. And those are the sorts of things that are just wildly inefficient, I think, to send to outside counsel. On top of which, I think that's also a role where having a really tight relationship with your internal business partners, right? Like in this case, the sales team, is so beneficial, right? So that's one example of like why I would not something that I brought in house actually pretty much immediately. And then I
And,
think
and time is, sorry to cut you off, time is also so critical to that too, right? You can just get
Mhm.
things turned around so much quicker in a lot of cases with those sales
Absolutely.
contracts when the deal just needs to close immediately.
Absolutely, right? And I mean, we talked about this earlier on our call. Those sales contracts, when those are closed, those actually affect the company's bottom line. Like time costs you money, right?
Totally.
And then I think like just sort of taking a step back beyond work like that, things that are very ad hoc where you only need to do them once or where you require really deep subject matter expertise, those are the sorts of things where maybe it doesn't make sense to hire someone internally or to roll the dice and hope that internally you could do a great job. Those are the sorts of things where it's absolutely worth spending money on outside counsel. So for example, if I had to do a lease negotiation for office space, the amount of money that you spend, right, on a commercial lease compared to how much money you would spend on paying outside counsel to help you with that negotiation, you may feel like, what, I don't want to spend 20 grand on negotiating a lease, but think about the fact that you're potentially paying millions of dollars over years, right? That's the sort of thing where you don't want to mess up because you only know as much as you know, right? And you need that outside expertise. And I would be a fool to hire a real estate attorney for Webflow. So
That makes sense.
outside that would go.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it.
Hmm.
Well, I really loved hearing about sort of your career journey. I'll just end by asking you what sort of advice you'd give to folks that really want to work in-house at top tech companies, either law students or people thinking about going to law school. What's sort of your overarching advice for folks?
Well, I think that law school is very different now than it was when I went to school. There are classes that are much more practical in nature. You don't have to just stick to classes that, help prepare you for the bar exam. And I would definitely take those. I would take them still with a grain of salt in that it's never going to be the same thing as real life, but those classes are actually really good. Like the few that I took, I still think about them sometimes and I'm grateful that I took those over, bar prep classes, right? So that's one thing you can do. I think the networking piece, much as I have not loved it for most of my career, I think it's really, really important. You never know who will be in a position to help you or who you might have impressed at some point, right? You're just never in a position to know that. But if you don't try, right, it doesn't like it you'll never know. And then, we also talked about keeping all doors open, right? I think taking the calls, even if you don't think you're going to do anything with them, taking the calls and being willing to put yourself in situations that make you uncomfortable. Like some of the best career moves that I have made were moves that made me profoundly uncomfortable, right? And
Wow.
those are some of the decisions that I look back on and I'm so glad that I made those choices. So
Wow.
yeah, so I think whether your question was specifically about going in house, but I think that very generic advice holds true regardless of what your goal is.
Amazing. Thanks for the words of wisdom. I'm cheering for you on the sidelines and for the entire Webflow team. And thanks so much for being on the podcast. It was great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.